So I'm here with Alissa Quart, and I'm just going to read, if I can find my glasses, her bio on the back of this book, which is called Going for Broke, Living on the Edge in the World's Richest Country. And Alissa's bio is as follows. Alissa Quart is executive director of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, co-created with the late Barbara Ehrenreich. She is also the author of numerous books, including Bootstrapped, Liberating Ourselves from the American Dream, which, by the way, I reread recently on the flight home from that funeral I was just talking about. Because I wanted to, you know, essentially I wanted to have you on because you are an advocate for writers and others who have found themselves unwittingly in situations of economic hardship. And I can't remember when we first met, but I do believe it had something to do with when I published a story about trying to get a job at the Container Store for the health insurance after I had a diagnosis of breast cancer. And before I ask you your first question, one of the things that struck me in the wake of that story, which I published on something called cafe.com, a little known at the time publication that suddenly went super viral in a way that was very damaging to me in the end result, because the New York Times took it upon themselves to essentially say, this woman went to Harvard, she's a journalist, she has resources, how dare she try to get a job at the Container Store? She probably wasn't that hard up. I'm sure there was family money. And the answer to all of that was no. I ended up having to go to the Harlem Breast Center to get a free mammogram and then to get a job with health insurance, because there wasn't Obamacare at the time. And thank God for that, by the way. And what struck me in that moment is that you're allowed to be poor in this country and you're allowed to be rich, but anyone who falls through the cracks in the middle class, it's their fault. What do you have to say
Yeah,
for that?
that was part of why I was really struck by your essay, because I had met you before. I met you with your, I don't know how much of your biography you get into.
Right.
I met you with your first husband, and in the late 90s, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
And you had just come out with Shutter Babe, I guess. That was your, and what interested me was how you had become this thing that I wrote about in Squeezed, the middle precariat, which is like middle class plus precarious and proletariat, which is something that I argue in that book and Bootstrapped. And in, I think, this book, Going for Broke, our anthology, illustrates it also, how close to the edge a lot of people that might appear to be what Barbara Ehrenreich called professional managerial class, how many of them are now falling out of that class, and what that looks like and why, and the sort of contingency, and what I say brain work has become gig work. And that's part of what you experience too, like for photographers, for writers, for accountants, for academics, many of these professions that we expected to be this kind of straight line have become existentially uncertain, economically uncertain, et cetera. So that was, your piece illustrated that to me, because I think you were working in the Container Store. Is that right?
Well, I tried to get a job at the Container Store and I was
Right.
rejected from the job at the Container Store. And so I wrote about that kind of tongue in cheek, but also quite seriously, because what had happened right before that is I went to a farmer's market and I was owed 3 different freelance payments, none of which had come through because, as you know, sometimes they wait 6 months to pay you, right? Normally 1 month, 2 months, but I was owed 3 payments. I was at the farmer's market. I wanted to buy some apples. I weighed the apples. I realized it was going to be $6 worth of apples, and that was half of my net worth. And I put the apples back and I walked home without them. And it was a defining moment for me of, yeah, I went to a good college and yeah, I grew up in the suburbs, but that doesn't protect you from industries like journalism, which were in a debt spiral at the time. And it was pre-Obamacare. So I had no health insurance. What I said was we are all just one job and one health scare or health issue away from doom. And
I mean,
that's,
I don't know if you read the Tom Skoka piece that just came out in New York Magazine about this, he wrote a very he was also a professional editor. He developed sort of like it's not clear, like some kind of mystery illness. And I just had a
Oh yeah,
mystery
yeah, I
illness.
read that. I read that. Yeah.
I just had like a post long COVID kind of situation. And just even with healthcare, he's waiting for months to see a specialist. I mean, this is part of what people are facing in this country. And, the line, of course, is that I have in my head, and he does too, is I could go private, pay people out of pocket, but our health insurance is already private.
Right.
So basically there's a double privacy around, like a double privatization with our healthcare and with a lot of things in American life that, we can think that things are public and that we're now getting if we spend more, we're getting the private version, but it's all private in a sense. And that was very striking to me, that piece where he's on this quest and he can't figure it out. And he again had been, seemingly had all these advantages, like many of the people in Going for Broke. Ray Suarez's story in Going for Broke is the one that always sticks out to me, because you know who Ray Suarez is, right? Right. Yeah. So he's this like kind of Walter Cronkite of, like a Puerto Rican Bronx kind of Walter Cronkite of my youth. And he's an amazing newsman. And I've done a lot of collaborations with him, but he wrote this powerful essay for us and for the Washington Post about how he got laid off from Al Jazeera, which was his last job. He had a bike accident and he hurt his tooth, and he had just given up his dental insurance, which is the typical middle precariat choice. Like, you're just like, okay, I'm not going to do the dental and the eye. I'm just going to do the medical or whatever, like cobbling it together kind of. And that was when he had this accident and he couldn't afford to go to a dentist, but he still owned his house. And I think it's interesting that what you said about being this mixed class identity, because I think that's something that you see a lot of in Going for Broke and in the people who write for us at Economic Hardship Reporting Project, where they may have had graduate education, they may own something, they may have debt, they may not have debt, but it's like a patchwork of having and having not, and that readers can sometimes like go apeshit over that. So pardon my cursing, but they can be just like, hey, why does this person in the photograph have a nice couch? This is something that people, or they'll find one thing to target when a lot of us have kind of complex class identities.
Right. By the way, I've never owned a home. So
Yeah.
like, I rent this place and I worry all the time about rents going up. It's like I've had to move from 1 to 3 different apartments because the rent became untenable.
Yeah.
I also, talking about the bike accident and the tooth. So I recently was in a car accident and something struck me in that car. Well, besides the car that struck me.
That's very striking.
I ran a stop sign, by the way, but
Yeah.
because I had Geico insurance, everything was covered. Like, because it wasn't my fault and because I had Geico, my hospital stay was covered, my ambulance was covered, all of my doctor's appointments, like none of that went through my medical insurance after the car accident. It all went through, I forget what it's called, but it's like the Geico. There's a phrase for it that's, I mean, because I'm menopausal, I can't think of the word, but it's like you go to the doctor and you tell them that you're this other class of citizen and everything is paid for. And it's like, well, why, if I get cancer, that's not my fault either. Like, why is it that if a car hits us, we get our medical care paid for, and if we are covered. But if cancer hits us, or if, mental health hits us, that's one of the other, stories I want to talk about. Why is it that we don't get those things covered? And the mental health article, in fact, I pulled from this for a second. Let me get my glasses back on, because the last line of this is an article called, Medicaid has been good to my body, but it has abandoned my brain. And it's by Katie Prout or Prout? Prout. And she talks about the fact that she can't get affordable mental health care, which I know, my children know, it's really, really hard to get affordable mental health care. My daughter, who's at med school right now, she gets it as part of her med school training. But like, we all lived through a pandemic. It would be great to have a mental health professional, but who can afford the $275, $350 a week that it costs right now. And at the end of this article, she finally gets a student who's 5 years younger than her to sort of talk her through her issues and act as her shrink. But he tells her, well, you really need a psychiatrist. I'm not efficient. Like, you need to get somebody to talk you through this. And she says, and the guy's name was Z. She calls him Z. She says, Z and I ended our session in June, but not for a bad reason. He graduated and got a job in a new place where, of course, Medicaid isn't accepted. In August, I started looking again for psychiatrists. During our last session, Z said, I have a lot of emotional, quote, hardiness, something that fortifies me even in the worst of times. I'm glad someone else can see that, but I wish I didn't have to be hardy. It's a finite resource, one best replenished with the right medication, therapeutic support, and a plain and simple break. I wish I didn't have to rely only on my heart and my rocks to make it through. I feel like I could have written those words word for word.
Yeah.
I am hardy. I know I am hardy. I am incredibly resilient, but there's only so much resilience you can have after being knocked down time and time again with things that are really beyond your control. Like for me, it was, a breast cancer diagnosis, and then there's, cervical cancer, and then getting my uterus out, and then, having something called vaginal cuff dehiscence. It was like one thing after another. And, you know, in that moment of need, my sixth grade boyfriend reached out to me, and I was, just back from a second operation, after having an operation 3 weeks earlier. And I needed to recover. And he said, I don't want you to worry about your health insurance, which at that time cost $2,400 a month, because I was on Cobra. He says, I'm going to pay for the next 3 months of your health insurance so that you can recover. I mean, what an incredible gift. And also what a terrible statement about our health insurance industry, that somebody would have to reach out from the ether, my sixth grade boyfriend, to save me at a moment when I really, really needed to be in bed.
And the thing is, the majority, I mean, of GoFundMe's are health
Oh, yeah.
GoFundMe's. And your experience is typical, and people may not even they don't have the platform you do, so they use these kind of crowdfunding sites to get their stories out, so people recognize that like they are in need. And people also start health campaigns for people who are in their immediate family or their friends. And it's a, as they say in Yiddish, it's a shanda. Or like a deep shame.
It is it is a true shame.
And yeah, so I think part of why I run EHRP, and Barbara created it, Barbara Ehrenreich, and we founded it, made it together, was that we felt that there are these stories that aren't told in their granularity in the mainstream media. And they include these kind of stories that are sort of, they're about poverty, but they're sort of about the atmosphere around hardship and need and financial struggle, the kind of ineffable things too, what I called it in one of my books, it's losing the narrative of your life. And that's the feeling. You're like, this is not my beautiful life. It's like, this is not my horrible life. Like, this is not my horrible medical life, And I think that people finding themselves in the state of sort of shock and dismay, and encountering for the first time, like, a lot of people also find this for the first time when they have kids, because you don't get hit up against it's like medical care, having children, when you've entered the job market. These are moments, I think, these moments of sort of social shock for people who, unless you were raised in poverty. But if you're raised with, like, in a kind of mixed class, as I call it, background, then you hit the symbolic world of, money and power, and you realize there's going to be all these gaps, and that you're being asked by this country to do it all on your own.
Well, you hit the limitations of what our lack of a social safety net provides for us. Nothing. So, each of my pregnancies cost me $9,000. That's three times.
No, this is something I saw too. I had this big bill for my pregnancy. I was like, what the?
$27,000 worth of making babies, right? And then you get out of the hospital, and my places of employment at the time covered 6 weeks of paid maternity leave, which was amazing back then, but it doesn't let your uterus heal or your vagina heal. So I was like, also, I just had a baby. I'd like to spend a little time with that baby, nursing them, perhaps, because that's best for them and for me.
Or if you have trouble nursing,
Oh, yeah.
feeding them. Or if you've adopted some, because I do think this whole nursing thing is just like, so, okay, like, lots of
I mean, like you, let's just say you as a
want
mother,
to spend
when your
time
child is an infant, you want to
parenting.
spend some time with them, and that child
Yes.
deserves some time with you.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
what was interesting is I had kids at the same time as my friend in Paris, and she was given, 4 months paid maternity leave, and then when she went back to work after 4 months, her child was put in a creche, which is a health a child care place, and she paid the equivalent of $25 a week, and she was at the high end of what she was paying for childcare. Versus, I remember my first child, already back then it was $400 a week in childcare. Like, as I looked at my salary, which was then $60,000, and the $400 a week, basically all of it, once you took taxes out, went to the child care provider.
Yeah.
And then after that, we have these healthcare expenses. And then if you lose your job, you have Cobra, which suddenly, at the moment that you lose a job and you have no more income, you're paying outrageous sums for healthcare. We could go on and on.
We could go on. But the thing I also want to make sure people get from our conversation is that there are happy stories here, and that being engaged in kind of edge economy. Some of the there's a story I love in here about the beauty of discount shopping.
Yeah, yeah, I love it.
What it takes to, outfit yourself in kind of it's not Lomans, but it's like the Lomans of today, which are sort of in the far reaches of New York or Atlanta or Chicago, and people are going through bins. But there's kind of expressivity here too that I think is really beautiful. There's poetry,
Beautiful.
poetry about being housing insecure. This is one of the contributors, Jen Fitzgerald. Wrote a very beautiful poem. Here, like, if this is not a poem about losing an apartment, nor is it a poem about losing 3 apartments in 3 months, which I could write for you. With deafness, this is not a song for my job long gone. I'm afraid this is an answer. I mean, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
That there's despair here, but there's a lot of beauty too.
Well, essentially what everybody has done in this book is they have taken their hardship and turned it into poetry of one kind or another, whether an actual poem or this beautiful piece of writing that I really wish we had more of in the regular press. And I think that editors of regular press, I'm calling them, the mainstream media, have not had economic hardship, do not know economic hardship, do not understand that those they ask to leave and take a buyout from their magazines and newspapers are suddenly in an incredibly precarious position because they no longer have their cushy health insurance. They no longer have the income. So they're not publishing stories in general that fill this book, and beautifully at that. And I also find that anytime you put your neck out to write about these things, again, somebody's going to try to cut you down and try to poke holes. So how have your
That's definitely happened. Like we have people here who people have clapped back at, when they've written about their issues, but the thing that I've really been impressed by too is the amount of interest and sympathy for these folks, and the way that I feel like sometimes these are the first time people have read about what it means to be a waitress. There's an essay about my life as a retail worker.
Yeah, I love that one where he's fitting a woman's shoes in the DC area, and she says, "No, but what do you really do?" And he says, "I sell shoes."
Right.
And he's confronted for the first time with, "This is what I do now."
Yeah. Or Zen and the Art of Uber Driving, which is also like about the rage of being an Uber driver. Somebody who had been a war correspondent who then became a strip club manager and then became an Uber driver, eventually started to was a weed smuggler. It's a whole other story, but 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 one of the things I loved about that piece is the writer's name is John Koopman, and the other pieces he's written is that he acknowledges that he sort of is adrenaline seeking. He's a war correspondent, and he'd rather be part of this kind of gray market of weed smuggling. This was before legalization, than work for Uber.
Right.
That it's also, there's a lot of despair in some of these things, but there's sort of joy sometimes in these borderline criminal activities that remind them of journalism, which is sort of interesting, right? Like encountering people and
Oh my God, like the woman who did her first she was hired by a John to go in his car and
yeah.
out into the woods. What happened there? He wanted her to take a photograph of him naked in the woods. That was a crazy story.
That's a crazy story. Lorelei Lee.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love that one. Yeah.
I mean, literally what happened. I read it
I'm not sure. I don't know. So
Yeah,
this is the thing, as an editor, you just sort of know sometimes as much as somebody writes, and then you're just like given it as a finished work and you're editing it, but you're not like necessarily following up and finding out the aftermath. I guess I should ask her to write a follow-up.
yeah, because I mean, the way I read it is she was working at a coffee shop. I don't know if it was Starbucks or not. And she was just like, I'm not making enough to pay rent. And she had 2 days before her rent was due. And she saw an ad in the newspaper saying, money for girls if you're between the ages of 18 and 27 or whatever it was. And so she's like, well, what can it hurt? And she goes out with this guy, doesn't know any of the rules of any of this, gets in a car with a stranger. He drives her into the woods. It seems like he's taken a gun from the back of his car, but we're not sure. He takes her into the woods. And then what I thought reading it was the gun was actually a camera, which he asks her to photograph him naked running through the woods. And then it was unclear to me, like, did he come back and get the camera?
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, let's find out. Let's find out. Yeah, so I guess the point we're making here is that, yeah, some of this is like really depressing, but there's also kind of strangeness, fantasy spaces, poetry, beauty, I wouldn't say happiness, but exuberance. Yeah.
I actually think while the topic is depressing, what these writers have done with it is really hopeful in a way. I mean, also just seeing it all collected and being able to, I mean, I've had this book by my bedside now for the past, month since you sent it to me. And every night I would just sort of read one and be taken into a world that I was so grateful to be taken into. So anyway, before I press stop on this recording, is there anything else that I've missed that you want to talk about?
From the book? I mean, I guess I could tell a little more about our organization for anybody who's
Yes, why don't we do that? Yes, go ahead.
So yeah, it's called the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. It's founded by Barbara Ehrenreich, the late great Barbara Ehrenreich, in 2011 or 12. I kind of came in a year later. She and I built it up into what it is. We commission and edit and co-publish with mainstream publications a lot of pieces, like the pieces we're talking about, and also like photography, poetry, film, illustration. There's some beautiful drawings here. Just this is some. And that was important to me too, because I have some visual background, and I was like, oh, I really want to have beautiful work and visually evocative work. And also social justice means like non-visual,
Right.
kind of like the picture editor of the Torah or something. But so no, but it's like, but so I wanted somebody who could actually do beautiful illustrations. So I asked Molly Crabapple, who's a great illustrator, to do kind of union drawings and drawings of dancers on subways, like in the Ben Shahn, Alice Neal tradition from the 1930s, the WPA kind of world of illustration. And so that's been going for many years, and we've been publishing people, getting people off on their feet too. So a lot of our contributors are now publishing more broadly, and they've sold books for serious book advances. And so people who'd never published before, a number of them. So that, to me, that's our success. It's like changing the mainstream media, who they include in what they publish, because we co-publish, working on these beautiful pieces that give perspectives that are not often heard, and then getting these folks writing again and shooting again. So it's threefold.
There was an interesting article recently about the woman who wrote Maid. What is her name?
Oh, Stephanie, yeah. She's
Stephanie.
written for us, yeah.
Yeah, so Stephanie wrote Maid, and then she wrote Class, and as part of the launch for Class, I forget who interviewed her. She talked about the fact that, well, yes, she's had this incredible success as New York Times bestselling author, and her story was made into a Netflix, but it doesn't mean that you're going to have economic stability after that. The publishing industry is fickle. They like you for a few years, then they don't like you so much. The idea that everybody else out there has of a New York Times bestseller and that you've got it made is just not the case.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. So if people are interested, they should go to economichardship.org, and they can also submit to us at info@economichardship.org, and we can send them to our pitch portal. If they're funders, potential funders, there's a donation button. We are supported by independent donations, but also philanthropy. If you're a magazine editor or somehow have a project or a platform, you should let us know too, because we co-publish.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me. I'm going to press stop, stay on, because I want to chat with
Okay.
you afterwards. But thank you so much. Hold on
Oh,
one
thank you.